Thank you. Thank you. Now I request Mr. Soli Sorabji for his remarks.
Mr. Sati, Professor Prusty, Professor James, and of course, Irene Khan. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor and privilege for me to chair this evening's function. Irene Khan really needs no introduction. She's been a remarkable Secretary General of Amnesty International. Irene has put human rights at the center of the efforts to end poverty. And by her research, writings, and papers, she has contributed greatly to the cause of human rights. Today, the world is faced with multiple challenges, ranging from global economic crisis, climate change, environmental degradation, armed conflicts, political instability, hunger, and pandemic disease. It is not generally realized that poverty is the most potent violator of human rights. Poverty remains our greatest problem and challenge. It accentuates the poverty of the poor, indeed keeps them poor. It's not sufficiently appreciated that protecting human rights of the poor gives them a voice so that they can play a meaningful role in determining their future. In a country governed by the basic principle of the rule of law, the lowest, the most humble must have a voice just as decisive as that of the affluent sections of society. I think you come to hear Irene Khan, and I've said enough, and now we look forward to Irene enlightening us on this important topic. Thank you. You can do from here, wherever you like.
Thank you. I have to begin by apologizing that I've done something that no speaker should ever do. I managed to almost lose my voice because of the air conditioning in the plane. Well, it's a great honor to be invited to address you this evening, and would like to thank RIS and the Indian Law Institute for their hospitality. And it's a particular privilege for me to speak in the presence of Mr. Soli Sorabji, whom I've met first many, many years ago. I was actually trying to calculate, and it's close to 37 years ago. I was then a young student at Harvard Law School with his daughter, Zia Modi, and Soli came as Solicitor General of India. And since then, of course, I have become a great admirer of his legal skills and his commitment to the rule of law. There are some other familiar faces in the room too, and it gives me great pleasure to see so many of you here, because the issue that I'm going to talk about, I believe, is an incredibly important one, and one to which India has made a great contribution and can continue to do so. Last week, I was in New York at the opening of the UN General Assembly, and as one leader after another took the podium, three things were evident. First, the international order is in flux. Power is shifting from the West to the rest, but is yet to find an even keel. Second, we are living in dangerous times and in an endangered world. And third, the path forward lies through shared understanding and respect for human rights and the rule of law. Geopolitical tensions are at an all-time high, and amid the chest thumping and the saber rattling at the UN Secretary General sounded a somber warning that we are at the risk of sleepwalking into war. Those were his exact words. Entrenched conflicts, violent extremism, and political turmoil are taking the toll on innocent people, civilians, women, children, the elderly, vulnerable groups, in blatant disregard of international humanitarian law, human rights, and even human decency. Large-scale migration and refugee flows have become the hallmark of our times. Emerging powers like India are experiencing economic growth at a record level, but the prosperity is not equally distributed. And rising inequalities are creating new sources of discontent. Many people around the world, in developed as well as developing countries, feel left out and left behind. And their discontent is being manifest in troubling ways, including the radicalization of youth, hostility towards refugees and migrants, distrust of established institutions, and the rise of populist leaders. A series of hurricanes and earthquakes in the Western Hemisphere this last week has served to remind us of a different kind of anger, the anger of Mother Earth. But even as the time bomb of climate change keeps ticking on, the Paris Agreement is being trashed by the planet's key polluter. And the Indian Foreign Minister, in her statement at the General Assembly, rightly reminded us that peace means peace not only among human beings, but also peace with nature. So at a time when the international community seems divided and divisive, the international consensus on sustainable development gains even greater importance as a shared platform for action. Just over 2 years, almost exactly 2 years ago, on September 25th, 2015, world leaders adopted what is arguably the most ambitious global development program ever, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, containing 17 SDGs or Sustainable Development Goals. And unlike their predecessor, the Millennium Development Goals, which in fact RIS in its publication has described the Millennium Development Goals, described them as reductionist, narrow, and formulated primarily by donor countries of the global north, while being imposed on countries of the global south without prior consultation. The SDGs, by comparison, are the product of extensive consultations at national, regional, and international levels with many governments and civil society, including India, playing an active role in forging this new agenda. And not surprisingly, the SDGs, of course, differ from the MDGs in a number of important ways. And this is in no small part due to the negotiating power of the new international order, or the emerging international order, I should say, which is asserting with increasing strength and success the interests of the global south. Let me highlight 4 features of the SDG, and I will focus on the 4th. The SDGs are universal. They're applicable to all countries, no matter where they lie on the development spectrum. It is symptomatic of a changing world order that for the first time, the richest countries of the world are being held to the same standards of development as the poorest. The SDGs are comprehensive and interlinked. They cover all 3 pillars of the sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental, and they put forward an integrated vision of development. For the first time ever, the interests of current generations to eradicate poverty and future generations to preserve fragile ecosystems and limited natural resources have to be aligned. Economic growth cannot be at any cost. The SDGs seek systemic change. Unlike the MDGs, they are not about statistical results. They are about digging deeper into the questions and the unfair systems at the international as well as national levels to make development inclusive and empowering so that no one will be left behind. Goal 10, for instance, talks about inequality among nations as well as within countries. And as if this was all not ambitious enough, the SDGs go further and take up the thorny issue of good governance and acknowledge that development cannot be sustainable. Development cannot be sustained without access to justice and the rule of law. And that idea is explicitly stated in Goal 16, but it is embedded implicitly in almost every other goal. And it's very important to remember the cross-cutting nature of rule of law and access to justice. And by doing so, I think we may have in front of us a game changer, providing, of course, we handle it well. The purpose of my lecture this evening is to look at that concept of rule of law and how it affects sustainable development. What is the rule of law? What is the relevance of the rule of law to sustainable development at national levels, at international levels, as Mr. Chaturvedi mentioned? What is the role that India can play as an emerging world power, the world's largest democracy, and a country committed to respect for the rule of law, but also a country where more than a third of the world's poorest people live? I will draw on the experience of my organization, the International Development Law Organization. It is the only intergovernmental organization in the world which is devoted exclusively to promoting the rule of law and development. Our mission is to enable governments and empower people to reform laws and strengthen institutions to advance peace, justice, and sustainable development. We believe in legal pluralism, working with all legal systems around the world. We also believe in local ownership and local partnership, and we always work closely with national and local authorities. IDLO works in some of the poorest and most insecure parts of the world, in countries like Afghanistan, Somalia, South Sudan, and Myanmar. But we are also increasingly working in emerging economies, emerging countries, emerging powers like Kenya, Mexico, and Ukraine. And I'm here to open a dialogue with Indian institutions, given India's tradition and commitment to the rule of law, to build partnerships and eventually, hopefully, to have India as a member of IDLO. In our experience, in IDLO's experience, no matter where in the development spectrum a particular country stands, maintaining peace, protecting the planet, eradicating poverty, or encouraging economic opportunity, they all require good laws and regulations that are fairly administered by transparent and accountable institutions, and that, most importantly, produce fair outcomes for all people. And we see the rule of law as crucial and relevant to all three dimensions of development: economic, social, or environmental. It is key to economic development because it provides for predictability and certainty through laws, a stable, transparent legal regime. It promotes social development by ensuring equal opportunity and equitable access to basic services. And it protects the environment by regulating a fair and transparent and sustainable distribution and usage of natural resources. Poverty eradication is the overriding aim of the SDGs. Insecurity and violence drive poverty and thrive where there is no rule of law. And that is not because the poor have a greater propensity for crime, but because laws and institutions very often fail to protect them. When the state does not have the capacity or is not willing to protect people or their property, when women are left with no recourse against gender-based violence, or when institutions are not strong enough to resolve conflict or tackle organized crimes. And those are often the features of the poorest countries of the world and the poorest neighborhoods in some of the richest countries of the world. Inequality is a major impediment to sustainable development. It grows when the rule of law does not function properly, when the law does not protect against discrimination, when opportunities are only open to a few based on wealth and privilege, when corruption and bribery deprive poor people of access to basic services, when big business interests override public interests, and when the law is selectively enforced in favor of the rich and powerful and against the poor. And I have seen this actually happening in some countries where tax fraud is ignored, but vagrancy laws are enforced rigorously. For most poor people, the law is not a powering or protective force, but a means of oppression and exclusion, a source of harassment or bribes. Poor people don't trust laws, courts, institutions, the police. Why should they turn to the law when the law rarely works in their favor? And too many poor people actually end up living outside the ambit of the law. And I say that as a lawyer. Now, I spent 21 years, from 1980 to 2001, with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. And those years, I saw governments, developed countries as well as developing countries, shut down borders, push back refugees, fine airlines to deter them from carrying asylum seekers, detain asylum seekers in harsh conditions. And there are plenty of international treaties and national laws to protect refugees. But refugees often find themselves in a legal no man's land without access to justice. And unless institutions uphold laws, rights cannot be protected. Now, let me hasten to add that India is not a party to the 1951 Refugee Convention and has no